This story is titled, I Caught My Husband Building an Exact Replica of Our House in His Virtual Reality Game. His digital family looks nothing like us, but exactly like his high school sweetheart. Have you ever had that gut-wrenching moment when you discover your entire life might be nothing but someone else's backup plan? That's where I am right now, sitting in our home office at 3 a.m., staring at my husband's VR headset, while my whole world crumbles around me. What I found wasn't just a game. It was an entire parallel life he'd built without me, and the worst part, his digital family looked exactly like the people I thought he'd left behind 15 years ago. I'm Andrea, 34F, and until yesterday, I thought I had the perfect marriage with Marcus, 35M. We met in college, got married right after graduation, and built what I believe was our dream life together. Marcus works as a video game developer, which means long hours but comfortable living. I'm an interior designer, and ironically, I spent the last decade making our house into the perfect home, or so I thought. Before I tell you how everything fell apart, you need to know about Emma, 35F, Marcus's high school sweetheart. I'd only seen her in old photos Marcus kept in a box in our attic, but I knew their story. They dated for 4 years in high school, had plans for college together, until Emma's family suddenly moved across the country during their senior year. Marcus was devastated, but eventually moved on, or that's what he told me. There's also Marcus's best friend, Tyler, 35M, who's been around since their high school days. He's the only one who still keeps in touch with Emma, though he never mentions her around me. At least, that's what I thought until recently. Looking back, I should have noticed how Tyler would get quiet whenever I talked about redecorating our house or planning our future. The last key player in this nightmare is Marcus's sister, Rachel, 32F. She's always been protective of her brother, sometimes to the point of being cold toward me. Now I wonder if she knew something I didn't all along. I never thought much about Marcus's growing obsession with VR gaming. He said it was research for work, making sure he stayed current with industry trends. I encouraged it, even. That's what supportive wives do, right? He'd spend hours in his home office, headset on, building what he called his test environments. I used to joke about how he was probably creating magical worlds filled with dragons and wizards. If only I'd known then what I know now. But let me tell you about the day everything changed, when I accidentally stumbled upon the truth about my husband's digital double life. Because what I discovered next made me question every moment of our 11-year marriage, every kiss, every "I love you," and every promise we ever made to each other. Want to know the most twisted part? The house he built in that game? It wasn't just similar to ours. It was an exact replica, down to the last detail. Every piece of furniture, every paint color, every family photo on the wall. Except in his virtual world, those photos told a very different story. It started with a headache. Not Marcus's, mine. I'd been getting terrible migraines lately, and that night, I desperately needed the emergency pain medication I kept in Marcus's office desk. He was at a late meeting, something that had become increasingly common over the past few months. I never questioned these meetings before, but now, well, hindsight is a cruel teacher. The office was exactly as he'd left it, VR headset on the desk, his multiple monitors displaying various development tools. I should have just grabbed the pills and left. But as I opened his desk drawer, I noticed something odd. A small notebook filled with what looked like interior design sketches. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized the layout. It was our house, but with subtle differences. Different furniture arrangements, color schemes I'd never choose, and notes in Marcus's handwriting. Emma's preferences. I'd never touched his VR headset before. It was his work equipment, his private space. But in that moment, with that notebook in my hands, something compelled me to put it on. The login screen appeared, and I knew I shouldn't go further. But then, I remembered his password, the same one he'd used for everything since college, our anniversary date. Except, it didn't work. My hands were shaking as I tried another date, May 15, 2007. Emma's birthday. I only knew it because I'd once seen it circled in his old high school yearbook. The headset blinked to life. What loaded wasn't some fantasy game world or work project. It was our house. Every room, every corner, perfectly recreated in stunning detail. But something felt off about the decor. It was all slightly different, more traditional than the modern style I'd chosen. Then I saw the photos on the virtual walls, and my blood ran cold. There they were, Marcus and Emma, smiling in front of our house. Emma holding a baby I'd never seen. Family portraits of them with 2 children who had her eyes and his smile. Holiday celebrations, birthday parties, anniversaries, an entire lifetime of moments that never happened, meticulously crafted in this digital world. The timestamps on the project file showed he'd been working on this for 3 years. 3 years of building this parallel life, while I slept next to him, planned our future, and wondered why he seemed increasingly distant during our own family discussions. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. I found his digital calendar, filled with regular meeting times labeled family time. They matched perfectly with his late nights at work. He wasn't at the office at all. He was here, in this virtual house, living his fantasy life with a woman he'd never truly gotten over. As I dug deeper into the files, I found conversations. Hundreds of them. Not just project notes, but full scenarios he'd written out. Conversations with virtual Emma about their day, about the children's school activities, about their future plans. The level of detail was staggering. He'd even recreated Emma's laugh. I knew because I found audio files labeled Emma's reactions that he'd somehow synthesized. I felt sick. Not just because of the betrayal, but because of how much work, how much passion he'd poured into this alternate reality. The Marcus I knew was meticulous, but never this devoted to anything. Except, apparently, this wasn't the Marcus I knew at all. Then I found something that made everything even worse. A recent email from Tyler to Marcus, minimized but not closed on one of the monitors. Emma's moving back to town next month. Are you sure you want to go through with this? My hands were trembling so badly I could barely type, but I needed answers. I opened Tyler's email thread with Marcus, and what I found made me question everything I thought I knew about our social circle. The emails went back months, full of updates about Emma's life, her divorce, her plans to return. Tyler hadn't just been keeping in touch with Emma. He'd been actively helping Marcus maintain his connection to her all these years. Reading through their exchanges was like watching my marriage dissolve in real time. Tyler had been sending Marcus regular photos of Emma, her life updates, even recordings of her voice from their phone calls. All of it carefully categorized, and used to make his virtual world more realistic. My stomach churned as I realized that Tyler, who'd been a groomsman at our wedding, who'd held my hand at my father's funeral last year, had been enabling this elaborate deception the entire time. But it was Rachel's involvement that truly broke me. Marcus's sister hadn't been cold to me out of protective instinct. She'd been actively helping Marcus and Emma stay connected. There were emails from her too, discussing how to handle the situation when Emma moved back. They even had a shared document titled Transition Plan. The clinical way they discussed my eventual replacement made me physically ill. As I dug deeper into Marcus's files, I found a folder labeled Future Updates. Inside were plans for our house, my house, with all traces of my design choices systematically erased. Traditional crown molding replacing my modern touches. Warm beige walls instead of my carefully chosen cool grays. A nursery designed in soft yellows and greens. Nothing like the blue and white theme I'd always dreamed of for our future children. The most devastating part? A document titled Timeline that outlined the next 6 months in meticulous detail. Marcus had it all planned out. Emma's return in July, their accidental reunion at a charity event Tyler was organizing in August, and a series of carefully orchestrated run-ins that would seem completely innocent to anyone watching, including me. But here's what made my blood run cold. According to the timeline, Marcus had already started laying the groundwork. Those extra hours at work? He'd actually been slowly moving money into a separate account. The sudden interest in couples therapy he'd suggested last month? Now I understood. He was setting up a paper trail of trying to make it work before everything fell apart. I was about to close the emails when a new message notification popped up. From Emma to Tyler, CC to Marcus's personal email. Just closed on the house. Everything's set for July. Can't believe we're finally doing this. The timestamp, 10 minutes ago. My migraine forgotten, I started taking screenshots of everything with my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. That's when I heard the garage door opening. Marcus was home early. In my panic to put everything back exactly as I'd found it, I knocked over a small box hidden behind his monitors. As it hit the floor, dozens of USB drives scattered across the carpet. Each one was labeled with a date and a simple description. Emma's birthday, our anniversary, Christmas morning. Years of archived virtual memories, carefully preserved and hidden away. I just managed to sweep them back into the box when Marcus's footsteps reached the top of the stairs. But in my rush, I'd forgotten one crucial detail. The VR headset was still running, still displaying his parallel life with Emma for anyone to see. And that's when I heard him stop dead in the doorway behind me. The silence that filled the room was deafening. I didn't turn around, couldn't turn around. On the monitor in front of me, Emma's smiling face stared back, a frozen image of the life Marcus really wanted. My fingers gripped the edge of his desk so hard my knuckles turned white. Never in 11 years of marriage had I seen Marcus lose his composure. He was always the calm one, the rational one, the one who could talk his way through any situation. But when I finally turned to face him, what I saw shocked me more than anything else I'd discovered that night. He was crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears you'd expect from someone caught in a betrayal. These were raw, almost primal sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. His legs gave out, and he slid down the doorframe to sit on the floor, his head in his hands. In that moment, he looked less like my successful, confident husband and more like that heartbroken 18-year-old boy from the photos in our attic. What happened next was even more unexpected. Instead of denials or excuses, Marcus started talking. Really talking, for what felt like the first time in years. The words poured out of him like a dam breaking. He told me about the day Emma left, how her parents had sprung the move on her with no warning, no chance for goodbyes. How they'd blocked his number, monitored her social media, even threatened a restraining order when he tried to contact her. He described how he tried to move on in college, how meeting me had felt like a second chance at happiness. And for a while, years even, it had been real. The love, the laughter, our life together. But then 3 years ago, Tyler had run into Emma at a conference. She was married, had moved across the country, built a new life. That should have been closure. Instead, it broke something open inside Marcus that he thought was long healed. The virtual reality project started as therapy, he claimed. A way to process his unresolved grief and trauma. But somewhere along the way, it had become an obsession. Every detail he learned about Emma's adult life became another piece in his digital puzzle. The more real he made it, the harder it became to stop. I listened, feeling oddly detached, as he explained how Tyler had initially tried to talk him out of it. How Rachel had only gotten involved recently, worried about his mental state. The transition plan wasn't for replacing me, he insisted. It was a therapy strategy his counselor had suggested for finally letting go of the past. The separate account was for paying for intensive therapy sessions he'd been too ashamed to tell me about. But then he said something that snapped me back to reality. Emma's marriage had fallen apart 6 months ago. She'd reached out to Tyler, who told Marcus. And suddenly, the virtual world wasn't enough anymore. The possibility of a real reconnection had awakened something in him that all those years of virtual fantasy couldn't satisfy. I should have been angry. I should have screamed, thrown things, stormed out. Instead, I felt an eerie calm as I picked up one of the USB drives from the floor. The label read, "First Anniversary." The date on it was from 2 years ago, the same day Marcus had forgotten our actual anniversary, claiming he was swamped with work. My voice was barely a whisper as I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since I first put on that headset. "When Emma moves back, were you ever going to tell me? Or was I supposed to play my part in your carefully scripted timeline until you'd set everything up perfectly?" His response changed everything I thought I knew about our marriage. But what he said next made me realize that Emma wasn't the only one living a double life. Marcus's next words hit me like a physical blow. "I know about the letters, Andrea." My heart stopped. The letters. The ones I'd written to Emma over the years, but never sent. The ones hidden in a locked drawer in my home office, each one carefully dated, each one expressing my growing guilt about being the replacement, the second choice, the woman who got to live the life that was meant for someone else. You see, I had my own secret. 10 years ago, just before our wedding, I'd found Emma's old diary in a box Marcus's mother had given him to sort through. I read it all in one night, every page of their young love story, their plans, their dreams. And I recognized something in those pages that Marcus had never admitted. The depth of what they'd had wasn't just teenage romance. It was the kind of love people write stories about. That knowledge had haunted me. I started writing to Emma, letters I never intended to send. At first, they were angry. How dare she hold this piece of my husband's heart hostage? Then they became apologetic, wondering if I'd stolen a life that wasn't meant to be mine. Finally, they turned confessional, admitting that sometimes, in quiet moments, I could feel her presence in our marriage like a ghost. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me an email from my personal account to Emma, dated 3 months ago. My blood ran cold as I read my own words on the screen. I've known about the VR world for months. I don't know how to tell him I found out. Part of me understands. We've both been living with your ghost for so long. Maybe it's time we all face the truth. I remembered writing the email in a moment of weakness, after discovering Marcus's virtual world. I'd saved it to drafts, never intending to send it. But there it was, in Emma's inbox, sent at 3 a.m. during one of my sleepless nights. I must have hit send by accident while half asleep, tormented by the weight of what I discovered. Emma had forwarded it to Marcus last week. The realization hit me. All those careful plans in his timeline, the therapy sessions, the transition plan, they weren't just about his unresolved feelings. They were about all of us, trying to find a way forward after years of living in the shadow of what could have been. But there was more. Marcus handed me his phone, showing me Emma's full response to my accidental email. As I read it, my understanding of the entire situation shifted dramatically. Because Emma had been harboring her own secret all these years, one that would change everything about how I saw my marriage and my role in this complex web of relationships. My hands trembled as I reached the end of her message. The truth she revealed wasn't just about her and Marcus. It was about me, and a choice I'd made years ago that I convinced myself everyone had forgotten. A choice that had set this whole tragedy in motion before I'd even met Marcus. Emma's email filled in the missing pieces of a puzzle I'd been part of without knowing. In senior year, before she moved away, Emma's parents hadn't just suddenly decided to relocate. They'd moved because of me. I was the anonymous student who reported Emma's father to the school board for academic fraud. He'd been helping students cheat on college entrance exams, including his own daughter. I discovered the scheme while working as an office aide, and my sense of justice compelled me to report it. The scandal forced him to resign, and the family moved away in shame. I'd buried this memory so deep I convinced myself it wasn't important anymore. But Emma had figured it out years ago. A mutual friend from high school had finally told her the truth about who reported her father. She'd spent months investigating, connecting the dots between the office aide who reported her father and the woman who eventually married Marcus. Her email was surprisingly free of bitterness. Instead, it was filled with a kind of sad understanding. She wrote about how her father's actions had tainted her own academic achievements, how she'd spent years rebuilding her life on honest foundations. The move, she wrote, had ultimately saved her from living a lie. But here was the twist that left me speechless. Emma had been the one orchestrating everything these past few months, not Marcus. She'd found out about Marcus's virtual world through Tyler, who'd accidentally mentioned it during one of their catch-up calls. Instead of being angry or hurt, she recognized it as a cry for help from someone who had never properly healed from trauma. She'd been secretly working with Rachel and Tyler to create a situation where everything would finally come to light. The transition plan wasn't about Marcus leaving me for Emma. It was a carefully crafted intervention strategy. Emma was indeed moving back, but not to rekindle an old flame. She was coming with her new fiancé, a grief counselor who specialized in helping people process unresolved loss. The house she'd bought wasn't for herself. It was an investment property she planned to sell to fund a youth counseling center. Those late meetings Marcus had been attending weren't virtual reality sessions. They were therapy appointments with Emma's fiancé, coordinated by Rachel. The separate account wasn't for running away. It was for paying back the money his virtual reality addiction had cost our marriage. As I reached the end of her email, I found myself facing a truth I'd never expected. Emma wasn't the ghost haunting our marriage. The real ghost was guilt. My guilt for my role in their separation, Marcus's guilt for moving on, Emma's guilt for keeping her discovery of my identity a secret for so long. Marcus watched silently as I processed everything. In his eyes, I could see the same overwhelming realization that I was feeling. We'd all been trapped in a web of unspoken truths, each of us thinking we were protecting the others, each of us carrying burdens we could have shared. But Emma's final words in the email suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that none of us had considered. A way that would require more courage than running away, more honesty than hiding in virtual worlds, and more forgiveness than any of us thought we were capable of. As I looked up from the phone at my husband, I realized we had a choice to make. And this time, it wouldn't be just Marcus and me making it. That night, sitting in Marcus's office surrounded by the digital remnants of his fantasy life, we talked until sunrise. Real talking, the kind we hadn't done in years. About guilt. About fear. About how sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. I looked at the virtual reality headset one last time before Marcus carefully packed it away. The perfect house, the perfect family, the perfect life he created. It had never been about replacing me. It had been about replacing his own sense of failure, his belief that he hadn't fought hard enough for Emma, hadn't been strong enough to help me when he'd eventually learned about my role in her family's departure. The virtual world had been his way of trying to fix a past that couldn't be fixed. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop, my hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold hours ago. Across from me sat Emma and her fiancé, James, 36M. She looked different from the photos in Marcus's virtual world, softer around the edges, with laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. James had kind eyes, and a quiet way of making space for difficult conversations. Emma shared her own journey of healing. After discovering my identity years ago, she'd gone through phases of anger, resentment, and finally, understanding. My report of her father's actions had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her family and herself. It had led her to her current work in educational reform, fighting to create fair opportunities for students without the advantages she'd once taken for granted. The youth counseling center she was planning wasn't just a random project. It was aimed at helping teenagers navigate ethical dilemmas and family pressures. She wanted to create a space where someone like my teenage self could find guidance before making decisions that would affect so many lives. Marcus began attending regular sessions with James, working through his tendency to escape into fantasy when reality became too difficult. The separate account he created was transformed into a fund for the counseling center. Tyler and Rachel, freed from their roles as secret keepers, became active supporters of the project. As for the virtual reality house, Marcus deleted it, but not before taking screenshots of the family photos he created. Not to hold on to the fantasy, but as a reminder of how easy it is to get lost in the perfect life you think you should have had, instead of nurturing the real one you built. I still write letters sometimes, but now they're emails to Emma about the counseling center's progress. My interior design skills have found a new purpose in creating welcoming spaces for troubled teens. Marcus channeled his VR expertise into developing therapeutic applications for trauma recovery. Sometimes healing comes not from erasing the past, but from transforming it into something meaningful. Last week, I found a new notebook in Marcus's office. Inside were sketches of another house. Not a perfect fantasy home, but plans for the counseling center, with notes about creating spaces where people could feel safe sharing their truths. In the margins, he'd written something that brought tears to my eyes. Reality is messy, but it's where real love grows. Emma and James are getting married next spring. They've asked both Marcus and me to be part of the ceremony. Not as symbols of the past, but as testament to how healing is possible when we stop running from our ghosts and start facing them together. The virtual reality headset sits in a box in our attic now, next to Emma's old diary and my unsent letters. Sometimes, the most valuable things we keep aren't the perfect memories of what could have been, but the messy reminders of how we found our way back to what's real. Marcus and I are building something new now. Not a perfect life, but an honest one. And maybe that's the greatest love story of all. Not the fantasy of what could have been, but the beauty of what is, scars and all.